Hi, great to see you all here. Thanks for coming. This is a follow-up event for the DEFI Institute, or DEFI Initiative, I'm so sorry, Digital Education Futures Initiative at Cambridge. Following our launch event in January, we had really interesting talks from Andreas Schleicher and from Dr. Merope and others, but there really wasn't enough time for questions. There wasn't enough time for discussion. And so we promised a follow-up event with more time for you, we hope, and for dialogue. So we've got 4 excellent speakers. They'll just be talking for 30 minutes, and then we'll have 1 hour for questions and answers. I'm Rupert Wegerif. I'm the director of DEFI, in case you're wondering what I'm doing here. So I'll just be hosting the event. I'm delighted to introduce our speakers. We've got Tom Crick, who's Professor of Digital Education and Policy at the School of Education in Swansea, but he's also advisor to the Welsh Government on digital divide issues. Sue Sentence, who's Head of Learning at Raspberry Pi, and Raspberry Pi have been very active in addressing the digital divide, as she'll tell you. And we've also got Sara, Hennessy and Björn Hassler here from the EdTech Hub, which I think is the largest EdTech research initiative in the world at the moment, or somebody told me that. Sara's Director of Research and Björn's Technical Director. So they'll tell us what they're doing with low-income countries. The order's going to be, I think, Sue first, then Sara and Björn, and then Tom. Do please ask questions in the question and answer rather than the chat. Oh, and I should have told you that we're recording. So if that's a problem, you know, you might think about your video presence. Oh yes, I did want to mention something slightly embarrassing. In order to keep people on time, because we often have events where people talk too long, I'm actually going to use a timer with a little beeper. So if you hear that, I'm not being rude to the speakers. They all know I'm going to do that. So I'm about to ask Sue to kick off, and I'm going to set you off for 10 minutes from now. Go, Sue.
Okay, can everyone see my screen? Yep, jolly good. Okay, I'll start my 10 minutes. Good evening or good morning, wherever you're from. I'm delighted to be able to join you in this panel session. Thank you very much to DEFI for inviting me. I'm going to start the series of talks by tackling the question that was advertised with the seminars around what is the digital divide, and look at some of the multifaceted nature of the digital divide, and then talk about some work that Raspberry Pi Foundation is doing. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at Raspberry Pi Foundation, which is an educational charity which is bringing computing education to people all around the world. And I'm also an academic in computing education with research in programming, pedagogy and other areas. So let's start with the digital divide. Sorry, there's a slight delay on the passing forward. So if you do a Google search for the term digital divide, you get lots of definitions that look like this. This is one from the Close the Gap Foundation. It says the digital divide is the gap that exists between those who have access to the internet and reliable devices and those that don't. So you've got this gap, you've got this access issue. You can read the rest of the definition, and lots of other definitions say something very similar. But I think we can question this definition a little bit, because for a start, this idea of having and having not brings a very dichotomous view around this term, and also the idea of access only is a little bit limited. So I want to think a little bit beyond access in terms of the digital divide. So there are various, there's a lot of work been done in this area, and there are various frameworks and models, etc. And I like this one when we talk about the 3 levels of the digital divide, with the bottom level being access. access to hardware, access to the internet, but building on that, also digital level 2 is digital skills and the uses that you have for the uses you put your skills in the digital world to. And level 3 is around the outcomes, and it's really important, I think, that we think about all 3 of these and not just access when we're talking about the digital divide. And you may be thinking about what factors, and I think some of the questions will be when we come up about this, what factors actually influence who has access, skills and use and outcomes. And again, there's quite a lot of literature on this, and so I thought I'd share this this piece of research from Shearder et al. From 2017, which was a review of some literature on what determinants or what factors influence whether you people have skills, uses and outcomes, level 2 and 3 of the digital divide. And if you look at all those, the column down the left, you see all the different possible factors, the determinants of skills, uses and outcomes. And the darker blue are the stronger determinants. So it's quite, it's probably not surprising that socio-demographic causes and economic reasons would influence whether you have skills, uses and outcomes in the internet and digital world. But if you look at the bottom right, you'll see that motivation also plays an important part. So we need to think about the digital divide beyond access and into the motivational things as well as socio-demographics. So to complete the little sort of mini tour of the literature, this multifaceted view then gives you this idea of technological capital or digital capital. And the idea of cultural capital, probably, as you know, comes from Pierre Bourdieu. And I like this quote: to possess the machines, we only need economic capital, but to appropriate them and use them in accordance with their specific purpose, we must have access to embodied cultural capital, either in person or in proxy. And I've taken from an article by Neil Selwyn. We can think about technological capital or digital capital as being this combination of economic, cultural and social capital, which Neil Selwyn talks about in terms of networks of technological things that, things that you're networking around in the world of ICT and digital world. So I think that's quite a useful way of introducing this topic. And then I wanted to look at the UK in particular. Now, we're not the worst. 96% of households in the UK had internet access in 2020, according to the ONS, went up from 93% in 2019, and I think 57% in 2006. Contrast that with the worldwide, 60%. We're doing quite well, and Sara and Björn will talk about an international context later on. But that 4% is actually 1 million households, and if you look at the Digital Access for All website, you'll see that nearly 2 million children, young people and families don't have access to device or connectivity in the home. And of course, we're all living through or have lived through the coronavirus pandemic, and you'll all be aware of the number of children that were just not able to access remote education from home because they didn't have the digital connectivity. Many people, because they can only access the internet through a smartphone, and that may not be sufficient for remote education, and also because their parents may not have the ability to support them. 22% of people in 2019 didn't have the essential digital skills needed for day-to-day life. So we've got a little bit of a way to go. I said I would talk about an initiative that the Raspberry Pi Foundation is doing. So we've coordinated some fundraising, some funds we've been able to raise, and also some work with 80 youth and community organisations to be able to distribute over 5,000 Raspberry Pi computers to vulnerable young people. That will be the figure by the end of this month. And we were working with, partnering with youth and community organisations, because it's really important that They had the local knowledge, the in-depth understanding of the people that we wanted to reach, the children we wanted to reach. And also, we didn't just give them a Raspberry Pi computer, we also gave them a 21-inch monitor and a headset and a webcam and everything they needed to be able to access school remotely, including a help desk and educational resources. And of course, I've been talking about outcomes. And, you know, it's really important that we don't just think about, oh, we gave out some computers, there we go, job done. And so, you know, it's important to think about who we've benefited from this. So we reached a lot of the people that the organisations we partnered with were working. Many of those children are on free school meals or have other vulnerabilities, a mixture of genders and an average age of 11. And we've done a follow-up study, which you can read about following the link on the right there, where we talk about interviews and case studies and surveys with the young people to find out what they've actually done with the devices. And children have talked about being able to do their homework, be able to work with their peers on projects, be able to communicate with their teacher. The quote there talks about how the young person in the quote might be able to email the teacher and ask for help. And the studies we've done showed that digital access had given them increased confidence and increased motivation. And we think that's really important. So that's my finishing up. I just wanted to suggest a few questions that we might want to go back to in the wider discussion that we have later on. I'm really interested to know if the things that we've learned through the pandemic will serve us in good stead when we come out of the pandemic, and whether we've reached more children on a longer term. I'm also interested to hear what other people think about the divide and this idea that it might be a term that generates a sort of deficit thinking, and also the difference between offline inequalities and digital inequalities and how they interact between them. And so that's plenty of food for thought. And so, Rupert, if I haven't heard the bell go off, but I think I'm within my time, I'll stop there and hand back to you. Thank you, everybody.
Oh, thank you, Sue. That was brilliant timing. We got it's exactly right. So you didn't hear the bell. It was about to go and I cancelled it. Thank you. We're not going to take questions between talks. Because we're just going to have the 3 short talks and then we'll go into the question mode. So I'm going to hand over directly to our next speakers, Sara and Björn, who are doing a double act. So over to you two, and I'll set the timer from almost now.
Thanks very much, Rupert. Okay, so as advertised, Björn and I are representing the EdTech Hub and telling you a little bit about the work that we're doing today. And just to say a thank you to the colleagues in the Hub whose work we're drawing on. So Björn will start off and then I'll join in. Oops.
All right, thank you so much, Sara, and hello everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to be spending some time and answering some questions and giving you a little bit of an overview of the work of the Hub as well. So on this first slide, you can see stuff that Sue's really already alluded to. This is a classic illustration of the digital divide. You see the countries that have better connectivity and the countries that have poorer connectivity. However, that digital divide really isn't along national borders. Even within higher income countries, we know that the digital divide persists along socioeconomic lines, even in the UK, even in the Netherlands and other places of Europe. Next slide. So here's a really stark illustration of this. You're seeing Human Development Index. So this is now not a measure of bandwidth, but a measure of human development. And what you see here is if you know your West Africa, you can make out, Ghana and Nigeria and all of those countries in West Africa. And what we have is the Human Development Index, not as it's normally drawn by country, but by region. And you can see the more yellow orangey regions that have higher Human Development Index and the darker redder regions that have lower Human Development Index. And you can see how this changes as you go from the coast, where there's a lot of trade, into the more northern regions in Ghana and in Nigeria and those other countries. You can also see how you can see some little isolated sort of yellow and orangey spots. If you roughly know where Mali is, you can spot Bamako, and Burkina Faso, just north of Ghana, you can see like the region around Ouagadougou having a higher development index. So it's also a subnational issue of differences in terms of connectivity in both low income and high income country. Next slide. So now, next slide. Yeah, thank you. So now the question is, we got the digital divide, we have the socioeconomic differences. What does that mean for schooling, right? And so here you can see some of these, the differences in the school closures during the peak of COVID, and we know that between June, July 2020, 1.5 billion children were out of school, and a third of those were estimated to have no access to education provision at all. And again, that's regionally dependent. Worldwide, it was about a third, but in sub-Saharan Africa, it was about half. And what I like to say, and you remember the previous slide, is when you're in Nairobi and you're saying, okay, 50% of the children have access, is it every other child that you bump into, in one of the nice shopping malls that you have in Nairobi? No, of course not. All of those children have access, but the children in the deep rural areas, none of those have access. And that's how the 50% is composed. Yeah, next slide, please. So here, this is also very interesting, right? We can't assume that even lower tech is ubiquitous in low-income countries. The response, the availability of tech within country and what tech you have access to, never mind, as we heard from Sue, using that technology and then using it for learning varies very hugely. So in less than 25% of low-income countries provide any type of remote learning, and most of these are using TV and radio, right? So in the low-income countries, we're really relying on TV and radio. And so by contrast, the high-income countries, see that big green bar that is online provision, many of the high-income countries rely on online provision. But you might recall that even in the UK, there was a campaign where the BBC actually put some of their online content back onto terrestrial television because there were children that couldn't access it, okay? And so just finally, before I hand over to Sara, there are big in-country differences. And we think, okay, let's go to the lowest possible rate. Come on, radio, surely people have a radio, right? Now, overall in Kenya, 71% of households own a radio. There's only 28% in Ethiopia and 24% in Tanzania. But now look at the urban-rural divide. So for example, in Mauritius, in urban areas, 3/4 have televisions. 3/4 of households have televisions. It's interesting, it's not all of them, right? It's only 3/4. But compare that to the rural area, it's only 7% of television ownership in rural areas. And similar statistics also apply to radios, right? So Turkana country, one of the poor and arid areas in Kenya, only 1 in 10 households own a radio. And that radio might not even be available to the child because it's used in other ways. And even if the child's using it and is accessing, educational radio programming, is that child actually learning? So you see there's a multitude of questions here. Next slide. I'm just going to very quickly go through the barriers to digital equity. You can just quickly glance down. This is the rural versus urban divide, as I've explained. Inequitable access in homes. There's language barriers. Most of the content is in English. The question is the content actually the right kind of content to appeal to children, to be intelligible to children? And then digital literacy depends on ordinary literacy. So we have a double barrier for children that don't have ordinary literacy and then can't develop digital literacy accordingly. Finally, policies can be barriers too, like discouragement of mobile phone use in some tertiary colleges, but also sometimes discouragement for open resources through certain types of policies. Right, so now, having painted this rather glum picture, I'm going to hand over to Sara to talk about some of the approaches that we're pursuing in the EdTech Hub.
Thanks, Björn. Okay, so what is the Hub doing? It's a research program, and we're trying to improve the evidence base, basically. And just to make the point that we're actually broadening the focus from perhaps what this session was focused on in terms of addressing the digital divide, to moving towards how can EdTech actually be used to address equity issues that are related to learning outcomes. So we're looking at sort of two sides of the coin there. The program is quite a large scale program going over 8 years. We're 2 years in, and we're concerned with scalable, sustainable, and contextualized and appropriate forms of EdTech use. So some of the marginalized learners that we focus on are those who are marginalized by poverty, and Björn's alluded to some of those statistics, by gender, by language, by disabilities and special needs, by being refugees or displaced learners, by being out of school. And again, he's talked about the huge numbers that that covers, and those who are in remote rural areas that are quite hard to reach with EdTech. I mean, there are some encouraging findings. When girls, for example, have access to tech, it can be actually more empowering for them than for boys, and the benefits are quite widespread. But we all know that girls often have much less access to technology, so they don't often get that chance owing to various cultural biases and so on. A recent review that was carried out by some of our colleagues into the use of EdTech for supporting children with disabilities indicates great potential for mobile apps for deaf learners and for those with visual impairment, for example. But they also identify that, you know, we need to consider the needs of the learners, get the right fit with the tech, get the right provision for them, and parents and teachers and carers all need to sort of be in that mix. They need to be consulted, but they also need to be developed and upskilled. And then funding has to be targeted in order for this to make progress. And in particular, governments need to join in. A clear conclusion from lots of the work that we're doing is that one size doesn't fit all. Learners' needs are different, contextual needs are different, and also the infrastructural constraints vary enormously. So we need a multimodal approach, and we need to combine high tech, low tech, and actually no tech if we want to reach all the marginalized learners. Low tech options can be quite apt in low-income countries, as you can imagine, especially where lots of learners are out of school. And a couple of examples have been the Rising on Air radio initiative during the pandemic, combined with text messaging, reached 10 million children. Another study carried out with large data by one of my PhD students, Joe Watson, showed that the educational TV cartoon in Tanzania improves maths learning for lots and lots of children, and it's highly cost effective compared to other educational interventions altogether. Another message is that, you know, we don't need to reinvent the wheel, and that keeps the cost low if we don't keep creating brand new resources. It's often more effective, more cheaper to build on what's already there by aligning with existing curriculum, keeping hold of the underlying pedagogies, and using the available hardware. One nice example is Calibri, which offers an open source ecosystem to support two important processes. So on the left, you can see Calibri Studio, which has a menu for the user to choose open educational resources such as Parathon Books or Khan Academy to align with the particular curriculum. And then those particular resources are transferred over to the Calibri VLE, and that can be used in a school or in a community setting without any connectivity, so it can be used offline. So students can access the resources then and undertake quizzes, and the teachers can log in to manage the work. Teachers and parents are obviously mediating the technology use, and parents especially during the pandemic. So it's important to develop them, but we find that the teacher professional development that they're offered is often lacking or inadequate. We're conducting a systematic literature review at the moment on tech-mediated TPD in low-income countries, and finding that there's quite a lot of work to do. Oops, sorry. One example of how we can support teachers is the OER for Schools program that Björn and I have developed and trialed in Zambia over some years. And this is, again, stressing the importance of being locally contextualized and teachers being able to adapt to their own contexts. And then I'll just finish. I still haven't heard the bell, Rupert. Oh, there it goes. Okay, right on time. Just to say, these are our 5, well, TPD is one of our main focus areas, and these are the others that we are concentrating our work on in the hub over the next couple of years. And we've identified these as being high potential evidence gaps. So there's some evidence that these are promising uses of tech for equity, but we still need to know more. So that's where the research will come. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will finish there.
Oh, thanks. Thanks very much, Björn and Sara. It sounds like amazing work, and we look forward to working closely with you and finding out more as things go along. So now we'll hand over without any further ado to Tom Crick. Over to you, Tom, and I'll set the timer. So
thank you all. Thanks. Hope we can give a slightly different perspective from some of the work that I've been doing and leading with colleagues in Wales over the past 10 years. That cuts across all of those, many of the themes that have been picked up by Sue, Bjorn and Sara. I think hopefully Wales can give this interesting kind of tractable national level case study about work that certainly focuses on digital in the broadest sense, but has a specific focus on education and skills, but also that wider public policy context and particular the kind of wider economic and infrastructural imperatives that we recognise are major political and policy considerations of the time, and certainly aren't going away anytime soon. So I'm going to give you a very rapid scan across the policy landscape in Wales and kind of hopefully frame some questions for the Q&A as we go forward. Cool. Okay, so we know the kind of wider sort of societal context, these things that play a massive role in our life. There is the sort of language that we have to be quite critical about when we talk about things like the digital economy and how this could make politicians and policymakers use some quite expansive language that actually is kind of difficult to manage and to work on it in a variety of contexts. We recognise the wider impact on the very young, particularly when we see the impact of things like social media on young people's lives and the dominance and the prevalence and use of technology. And actually that sort of a much more considered evidence-based kind of critical use, where we talk about things like screen time and social media and online harms, some of the sort of legislative context that's happening in the UK at the moment, but also the very old, because I think when we can think about different segments of society, we can focus very much in an education context and think about young people, the impact on digital and young people's lives. But then we can think about, you have to consider that wider digital exclusion or digital inclusion piece, and particularly an older kind of demographic too. And that's we'll start to see the kind of interesting context from Wales in a devolved nation context, where you have that ability to do really interesting kind of public policy context and sort of interdisciplinary or kind of cross-governmental portfolio work because of the size of the country and because of the ability to interact with senior civil servants and politicians and policymakers. And also, when you think about kind of public service delivery, education is going to be a clear focus of some of my talk here, but also how that sits with, wider public health context and digital health and social care. And importantly for Wales, when we talk about the specific kind of cultural context and a bilingual context, the ability to meaningfully access these services through the language of your choice. So Welsh and English are the two national languages, the two legal languages of Wales. And that places a really important context for acknowledging, I suppose, the portability, the replicability of some of this work into other nations and jurisdictions across the world. And actually, there's a very interesting kind of legislative context around the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act when we look at things like Sustainable Development Goals and how that's enshrined in legislation. And there's duties on kind of named public bodies. We think about this in the context of infrastructure investments. We think about this in the context of the future economy, Industry 4.0, digital innovation, AI, automation. What does this look like in the context of a small nation like Wales, and especially in the context of post-COVID, post-Brexit economic recovery? And this is framed around things like major initiatives like city deals, kind of multi-billion-pound city deals. But actually, we are talking about huge sort of governmental intervention to address various levels, multi-level kind of interventions to change regions and to invest in infrastructure for the betterment of kind of citizens and services and industry. But I think the kind of COVID context has really driven some of this thinking. And so Nest have done some interesting work around digital and data poverty. And that's really been kind of clear when you look at some of the kind of challenges facing various kind of socioeconomic communities, particularly post-industrial communities in Wales. And actually, that's framed some of the thinking around the major national curriculum reforms that were published in January 2020, just before a major global kind of pandemic. But I've led the major kind of science and technology curriculum reforms in Wales over the past 10 years around, a review of the ICT curriculum and thinking about cross-curricular digital competence, kind of in a bilingual sense, but also rethinking what we mean by kind of, science and technology education in the context of a national curriculum from the ages of 3 to 16. And this has been driven by huge international focus and scrutiny, kind of PISA results, and what's the aim of a national curriculum, what are the aims and the ambitions for education more generally, and actually the context of these 4 overriding purposes to the new curriculum. So when you think about kind of addressing those sort of divides, inequality and equity within the system, and trying to give young people the biggest opportunity they can for their lives, and think about actually how do you enshrine that in legislation, actually then that changes kind of policy and practice and actually has an impact on education skills, qualifications, and the wider kind of system level reforms that are ongoing and have been sort of somewhat impacted by the kind of the pandemic. And one of those things which I led in 2015 around thinking about cross-curricular digital competence. So thinking that in a very broad sense, it's not just about IT user skills, but we're talking about digital citizenship, we're talking about digital rights, and actually empowering young people to kind of, to consider like, well, what do we want them to be able to do? It's giving them agency and thinking in the context of young people's digital rights is not just about teaching them how to use office productivity software, but actually that is a big question to ask. And it's not just about teaching them how to program and teaching them how to code, even though there is a wider kind of, has been a clear focus imperative on this at the kind of UK scale and obviously in lots of other countries and jurisdictions over recent years around kind of, computer science curriculum reform. But actually then you've got this wider societal piece. When we talk about kind of addressing that digital divide, I think we can crack, because of things like we have the ability to change the curriculum and change qualifications, and we can develop teachers and change behaviors and cultures within schools and colleges. How do we address that kind of wider sort of digital inclusion piece when we are talking about addressing the digital divide? So I suppose the kind of context for Wales is interesting because, as I said, small, agile, digital nation, you've got some interesting kind of cultural context, and you have a rich sort of heritage and history. And the kind of bilingual context is really, really interesting, and the ability to do stuff at national scale with the diversity, kind of rural, urban. You've got kind of the challenging sort of the population distribution of Wales, and actually think about kind of legacy infrastructure investments and what does that look like in the next kind of 5, 10, 15, 20 years. But clearly the focus around this is we're in the midst of the most profound and significant changes to education in Wales ever, certainly since devolution in 1999 from the UK government. But we are talking about wholesale curriculum qualifications change and what that means to be a teacher in Wales. What's the aim, the intentions of kind of education and skills and qualifications, and digital kind of cuts across all of this. We are talking in the context of, we recognise and acknowledge the importance, both in the statutory footing, but also from a cultural imperative around the importance of what does a bilingual kind of digital society and culture look like, and actually how do you foster and support that. We're addressing the, trying to think about this in the context of actually the public misunderstanding of digital technology. What's this, fake news, misinformation, disinformation? How do we create digitally confident and capable citizens, and actually recognize that this is, there's a cyber kind of e-safety perspective, but actually we want to be able to ask questions of our elected representatives and to query it when government ministers say we should ban encryption because it's inconvenient. These are the sort of things actually we do want these to be to people to have kind of public discourse around these kind of contemporary issues and how it affects and impacts on people and society and cultures and jobs and everything. And actually, so you need digitally confident, capable policymakers and politicians. So actually, why do we not push for this? Why do we not demand more for this? And actually, it's interesting. This is kind of the context of, as we have elections next week in Wales for the Senedd Cymru, for Welsh Parliament. These sort of issues are front and centre because of the importance of digital innovation for the economy and what that looks like for the future Welsh economy over the next kind of 5, 10, 15 years. And I think that where you're asking these big questions around, well, what does it mean to have the kind of digital and data infrastructure in Wales to address some of these kind of socioeconomic challenges and to address some of those, the examples that were given by Sara and Björn before. And actually we are then talking in the context of like, well, actually what does that look like for public services? Because this is the way that people interact with government and the interaction between citizens and state. And actually that's where you get this wider future generations piece around, well, hold on, we are talking about sustainability. We have the legislative context to be able to do this, and you have the responsibility on public bodies to think about this. And you are talking about the kind of co-creation piece. You will have to make things like, health and social care or education. You need to make it learner-centered. You need to make it patient-centered. You need to make these things citizen-centered. And actually, I think the kind of the context there is around, where is the criticality around some of these things? So it isn't just about AI is going to be this wondrous thing, or autonomous vehicles or smart cities, and actually the criticality around well, what's the potential impact of some of these tools and technologies, and how will it affect people, and what's the benefits? So the kind of citizen-centered co-creation piece is front and center with some of these kind of ongoing discussions at Wales. And finally, you know, pragmatically, we know the context from COVID, the impact it's had on education in particular, but actually what does that look like kind of going forward, this kind of new abnormal, and how will we address some of those challenges? Because these things are, you know, we've crossed the Rubicon, they're not going to go away anytime soon. So hopefully that will sow the seeds for some of our discussions going forwards. Dr. Valerian, thank you very much, and look forward to the discussions.
You'd obviously rehearsed that, Tom. It was such perfect timing. Well done.
No, I haven't. I literally just finished my slides where Sue was speaking, so it's fine.
Brilliant. Well, thanks for all of our expert speakers. I found that fascinating. We have a number of questions here, some of which we have live, and some of which I'll transmit from people who've sent them in and who have them on the question and answer. So, first question was Kevin. Could you put your question, Kevin? Kevin Martin, who's a PhD student at Cambridge.
Yes, thank you everyone for a really helpful webinar. Throughout this discussion, you have identified digital access as a confluence of multiple factors, including technological infrastructure, socioeconomic resources, and pedagogy. Considering that we are all educators, pedagogy is the tool we readily have available to use. So my question is, to what extent can creative uses of pedagogy mitigate the existing divides in digital access and change the calculus for the most marginalized populations? Are there other pedagogical tools you have identified beyond, for instance, the Raspberry Pi initiatives, or the use of radio or televised educational programming in low and middle income countries? Thank you.
Well, I guess that's probably a question addressed to everyone, but what do you think, Sue? Do you, because she mentioned Raspberry Pi, do you have a view?
Yes, and I think it's a very interesting question, because it's really important that we can make the motivation that I referred to in talking about learning outcomes around digital, that we think about motivating young people to be able to want to gain the sort of digital skills and the digital knowledge that will you know, take them a long way. And I think sometimes a very inquiry-based approach to introducing digital and trying, and Tom talked about empowering young people by looking at things that really matter to young people and looking at digital solutions for those, and where digital tools might come in. And I think that's within the realms of the teacher in introducing digital literacy and digital skills and digital competencies, enabling all young people, wherever their background, to be able to see that this can be important to them. And I also think that there are other things like working together, working collaboratively, working on projects that are actually very contextualized to the local areas and relevant to the community, can also help in this kind of like motivational and empowering way, and make sense to all young people, if that helps.
Well, what I mean, do any other members of the panel want to pick that up?
Yeah, I'd be quite happy to chip in if that's okay. Especially from a kind of southern perspective. So when we talk about low-income countries, you know, they're not really just southern anymore, but when we talk from a low-income countries perspective, we have to ask ourselves, what are the real game changers? Where could you get out more, so to speak, than what you put in? So, and if you say, okay, well, we're going to give a tablet to every child, or we're going to give a phone to every child, there's just a natural scaling problem with that, you know, because the cost of a phone is what it is. And even if it's really cheap, even if it's just $15 for a non-smartphone, you know, once you have 1 million children and you need to get a new phone every 2 years, it just goes way beyond what donor funding or national funding makes available. So the question is, what are the real kind of game changers in this? And I think one of the game changers is to really think about the things that are already scaling, right? So most education systems are desperately trying to get hold of better education data for their whole country, right? And so, for example, there's some really interesting approaches that using geospatial data for catchment area assessment. So don't build schools randomly, but do some geospatial assessments that will tell you where the schools need to be built to minimize walking distances for children. And technologies like that, you know, while they're not at the child level or even at the teacher level, they could make a huge impact by giving more children access to school, getting them faster to school. Another thing that we also saw with OER for schools is this question of open resources. There is still so much reliance on commercial textbooks, and actually the Open Up Resources Initiative in the USA, you know, one of the higher income countries around the planet, have actually switched 12 states over to openly licensed core curriculum materials because it was a saving for those states in the United States, right? And so in the low income countries, we need to learn from that, and we need to really think about what could we do to really massively accelerate development.
Yeah, I'd echo lots of comments there. I mean, I think the point around Björn mentioned around things like, you know, OER, kind of open educational resources, is a real key kind of aspect to that. And that's not, you know, I think that applies to every kind of nation and region in the world. The idea that's I think that has applicability and has massive impact. I think I fear the kind of COVID sort of crisis has driven thinking around the solution or the endpoint is just to give people a device and a dongle, and your job is done. It's like, you know, government are like, well, we did well there. Like, that's what a great result for us. And I think that's the start of the solution, because that actually is just really brought to the fore, which we, you know, the data already kind of suggested it, but, you know, we've seen the kind of the inequity or the inequality, or certainly the kind of digital and data poverty challenge with this. And actually, it's not just about giving, you know, kids a tablet or access to, you know, kind of connectivity. So I fear some of this, you know, this is where you kind of get the wicked issue stuff, because actually it's easy to do, you know, you need to fix some of those other problems, and needs kind of cross-government portfolio initiatives. And it is, you know, it's a bit like solve the public health crisis now, and you don't downstream have to address when people have diabetes and obesity. And I think that's sometimes the challenge with some of these issues, when it is much easier to find the capital expenditure to buy a load of tablets, and not to solve the ongoing revenue spend for the next kind of 15, 20 years. So maybe that's, you know, the point I was alluding to was around new models for financing some of this stuff. It's the sustainability of some of these interventions, and to recognize that actually it isn't just thinking in the, you know, the 5 years of a government. You know, you do have to think about kind of multi-government, that longer term, you know, future generation stuff, which is that you have to change the mindset for some of these problems.
Well, thanks, Tom. Sara, you look like you.
Yeah, just, I mean, the others have said a lot of the things I totally agree with. Just one or two maybe small points. I mean, on Tom's last point, yes, and I think, you know, having kind of effective and affordable and sustainable uses of technology is going to require those kind of partnerships, planning ahead, long-term thinking, systems thinking, political will, which he's alluded to in his talk already, leadership, you know, commitment across a whole range of stakeholders, government as well as others. And, you know, it's just essential for that kind of joined up thinking to be in place. The other thing, I guess the other point I would just say on the pedagogy, I mean, Björn's alluded to it with the OER for schools thing, but it's also about thinking how pedagogy can be adapted towards reaching, you know, the most marginalized learners, and developing inclusive and culturally appropriate pedagogies, gender responsive pedagogies. There's some pioneering approaches in those areas, but it's all too far and few between, you know, yeah, just too rare, basically. So yeah, just wanting to raise the need and the hope that, you know, we can move forward in addressing that more systematically.
Oh, thank you all very much. Kevin, can I go back to you? Have they sort of answered your question, or do you have any thoughts and responses on that?
I've taken 2 pages of notes in those couple of minutes of talking. So yes, you've answered my question. Thank you. That was extremely helpful.
Oh, great. I'm going to turn now to Mark Neeson, who has a question. Mark is the head of professional development in the Cambridge Partnerships for Education, and we DEFI are working closely with CPE, Cambridge Partnerships. So what's your question, Mark?
Thank you very much, and very interesting talks to date, and looking forward to the rest of the discussion. In many ways, as people have already talked about, the discussion on digital divide is one about digital equity, as even if everyone in the world had access to the internet, there would still be inequity due to the range of devices people have. That could include analog as well as digital, and the different levels of skills people have to use those devices. As such, can the digital divide ever be resolved? If so, how? If not, how do we manage it going forward? And particularly, actually thinking about it, how do we support others with managing it, particularly in developing countries and their resource?
Well, that's who can I turn to for that one? Who'd like to answer that?
I'm happy to start off there. I mean, I think it's kind of interesting whether this, it's like a classic kind of academics response to say, define your terms, in the sense of, it becomes a sort of intellectual sophistry to sort of say, well, actually, will there always be some form of divide? That's the reality of life. And is it about there's a continuous improvement piece? I think it kind of maybe links back to a bit to my previous point around, I fear sometimes politicians, for example, think things are done and resolved, whereas actually the digital divide may be something that is never fully resolved. You're always trying to address it in various ways and in various forms, and that's actually could be a reality of just the nature of technological development, but also the challenges that different parts of the world or different parts of the country or different demographics face all the time. So I hope that's not sort of some kind of cop-out answer, but I suppose I'd like to think that I can't see this ever being done, and we'll never need to think about it again. I think that feels quite a clear challenge, because you'll always have a divide. You're trying to minimize that divide and make sure the baseline is always pulled up, or the kind of the median is as high as it could possibly be. But I think that is part of the challenge. You can see from broadband connectivity across the UK. I mean, that's a great example, isn't it? And obviously the last 3% are extremely difficult to provide super fast kind of connectivity, but there are ways around that. We can think about novel kind of hybrid solutions for addressing some of these problems, but to think that is done is probably is also quite naive, kind of short-term thinking as well.
Well, thanks, Tom. It's certainly a challenging and long-term question. Unless anyone has any urgent points on that, I was going to move on. Oh, Sue, tell us, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say something. I mean, yes, we're always going to have inequity, it is, unfortunately we are, but I just wanted to say that in terms of, and I can't talk about developing countries too much, but if we want everybody to have access to something, we need to have it in free public education. I mean, basically it needs to be in school. So if we're going to be developing digital skills and make sort of make available to everybody, we need to make sure that it's made a priority in all schools, and that we train teachers and we support teachers, and we introduce digital education in every country. And that's the biggest sort of social way of bringing something to everybody. That's what I wanted to add.
Oh, thanks. I now move on to, I've got another question here from James Law from Newcastle. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, James, and your question. I think it's a question particularly for Björn. So Björn.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for not inviting me, but I came through Melanie Grayo, who's part of your group, I think. My question is, I'm a professor of speech and language sciences, so actually it's not directly related to my expertise, but we've been doing some work on telehealth, and so this is an interesting area for me. I'm interested in what you've said about game changers, all right? And my question is, I'm going to read out what I wrote, sent in a bit earlier on, but it actually goes over what a number of you have said already. But so at the very least, the pandemic has highlighted the social inequalities in access to the internet. school learning on pay-as-you-go phones, children competing with parents for access to hardware, and part of the country with very poor reception, exacerbating geographical exclusion, etc. And you know, you've been talking about this already. Making local authorities the primary supplier of laptops in the UK, as has happened over the last few months, in part addresses the easy part of the access question. And I think the physical objects are the easy bit. I know they're expensive, that's not the point though. But how do we get the internet into everyone's homes? And you're right, Sarah, you know, the schools, the schools issue is as important, but it's the same point. If you haven't got people using it routinely at home, learning it, if it's only a school thing, then it's not going to become, they're not going to become digital natives in the same way. It's not the school that's going to be the primary teacher of this stuff, I think. So my question is, isn't it time to stop pussyfooting around the problem and see the internet as a national utility with equal speeds for everyone? So it's an equality issue at a national level, and acknowledge that the only way we are likely to achieve a universal coverage is through satellite delivery of the internet, and nation states should be buying into that. I mean, the satellites went up last year, so it's already started. And I just would like people's view. It's a sort of mega view, but if you don't have full proper access in people's homes, have we got any future? The digital inequalities are just going to persist.
Well, thank you very much for that, James. I was amazed by the potential of Elon Musk's Starlink satellite network, and I was also amazed by the sort of deafening silence that it was met with by all my colleagues on Twitter and the internet. Maybe because it's something to do with Elon, I don't know. What do you think about that, Björn? Do you have a view?
Yeah, so I would say I would regard connectivity as a kind of, as a desirable human right. So I wouldn't want to dispute that, right? Now, what is the right technology? I think when you look at people doing this commercially, and the Microsoft Airband initiative is a really, really good example, connectivity is always about a portfolio of approaches. So yes, satellite connectivity is really important, but there's also lots of other types of connectivity. I think realistically, I would say from a sort of technological perspective, really a portfolio approach is the right one. But that's not to say that we shouldn't be using satellite technology or that people shouldn't have access. It's just that when you really do it on the ground and you really look at how fast you can get connectivity into places, like a portfolio approach is best. I'll post a link to the Microsoft Airband initiative in a minute. Now, should everyone have access to the internet right now? Well, yes. But in many low-income countries, you know, there is the opportunity cost of that. And we do know that digital literacy, for example, depends on ordinary literacy. If you don't have basic mathematics and numeracy and literacy skills, you won't actually benefit from the internet all that much. Also, digital learning is not just about the internet. So you look at GeoGebra, for instance, used by millions of mathematics teachers around the globe. You can use that. You don't need connectivity for that. Digital problem solving with spreadsheets, you don't need connectivity for that. So, while it would be nice for everyone to have, say, broadband connectivity right now, I don't actually think that from an education perspective, it is a priority. What I would say is give free, so the slow, we have like 5G, 4G, broadband, fiber, all of that. But, the slowest forms of connectivity are GSM, and so GPRS, right? And like 2G and things like that, Edge, the things that we don't even use anymore. Why not give everybody around the world free SMS and free GPRS connectivity, right? That means you can send free text messages and you can communicate with people about your business needs through WhatsApp. So I would advocate for that, because from a low-income country perspective, that is something that is actually achievable. Whereas if we say everybody broadband now in low-income countries, that's going to start in the cities. That's going to start where there's internet connectivity already. Now, satellite might change some of that. We'll see how kind of Starlink and all of that turns out. That's been tried many times. We'll see. It might work this time. But at the end of the day, it is also about devices for people, and no satellite will make a difference to that. I'm very happy to have more conversations about this. I think it's a really, really important thing.
But can I just come back on that? There's a chicken and egg thing about the mathematical and literacy you need in order to use the internet. And there's been quite a lot of work around self-organized learning, which rather implies that if you give the children, it's true, it's children, right? But if you give the children the tools, they will teach themselves using the internet. So it's not like they need, you know, formal national curriculum type training before they can access it. They instinctively use it as a learning device.
Yeah, I mean, I would respectfully disagree or differentiate the question. I mean, I have a couple of nephews, you know, my sister's a teacher. They're, you know, by all means a middle class household. My mother, so their grandmother did the homeschooling for them. Yes, they learn themselves. But actually the most marginalized don't, and especially in primary school, there is a lot of reliance, especially in primary school, there's a lot of reliance on having a facilitator of learning. And actually what we see, even in higher grades, even with radio instruction, TV instruction, it is so important to have a facilitator around. Now that doesn't necessarily have to be a teacher, but I think the idea that children are self, I could go on about this endlessly. I can send you some research and stuff where from low-income countries with randomized control trials and all of that actually show that actually community has a big, you know, has a big kind of impact on that. But you know, yeah, we could debate that all.
Can I ask Tom to come in on?
Yeah, I just there's a couple of specific points. I mean, I think I'd be quite critical about the kind of the myth, the digital native type stuff. It's been quite powerful language that's been used by politicians, but having, I suppose, written part of a national curriculum lately, and also just seeing the kind of the practice in schools in a lot of different settings and contexts. I think you get very superficial and narrow kind of digital competence or competencies. And, you know, yes, they are confident in using technology. I've got a 6-year-old and a 3.5-year-old. They are fantastically digitally competent when they're navigating, watching stuff on YouTube. But I don't think you don't see the transferability of that. And I think we have to be really, really careful about just describing. I think that can be quite socioeconomically driven. I think just on the point, your overarching point around, you know, I think there is some political, ideological stuff there. And I think there's a comment in the chat around, you know, recent, the UK, the Labour Party in the UK had proposed kind of, you know, this being sort of a nationalised kind of public service. I think I recognised the opportunities. You know, I think is it a basic human right? Well, access to information is interesting. You know, the right to education. I think there are some stronger and stronger arguments for this. I'm a commissioner of the National Infrastructure Commission for Wales, and we have a very specific challenge in Wales because of the you know, the kind of geography and sort of topography of Wales, and certainly the kind of challenges of connecting everyone from a universal service obligation. That's really difficult. And actually just saying everyone in the UK should have 30 meg downstream, that doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't solve some of the wider kind of digital stuff around that. I think satellites are part of the solution, but it's a much more kind of diverse, hybridized solution to some of these problems, I think. But satellite are part, but then you have issues with latency and all that kind of stuff. And actually that doesn't solve all of your problems. But I think, I think there was another point raised briefly before around, it's not just about schools, it's not just about teachers, and there's a societal piece. So actually you do need to do stuff with parents, because, you know, the stuff in the online harms kind of bill in the UK, or, you know, the fact is when schools used to block YouTube, it's futile because they have unrestricted access to the internet at home. Their parents don't know what they're doing. So you do need to address that wider societal piece too. Sorry, I know others want to come in as well.
Oh, well, I think I'm conscious of time, and we do have some other good questions. So unless you really wanted to speak on this, Sarah or Sue, I'll move on to a question we have from Alan Greenberg. Do you want to put the question, Alan, and just say who can you say who you are briefly, or?
I normally take 3 hours on that subject. I'll give you the briefer version. Ex-Apple, my team built podcasting, iTunes U, and the like. I now have a portfolio of both education, health tech businesses. Can I just say, I want to circle back to the concluding slides, both from Sarah and Tom. And Tom, thank you for getting through 24 slides in 10 minutes. That's a pretty remarkable achievement in itself. But there was something you touched on, which I think is particularly important in terms of education is not just for school children. And if I could just give some context here, I mean, I've been sitting in my third bedroom since March the 10th, 2020, and I've noticed the world change in front of me. And the change is fundamentally that we've got distributed networks of homeschooling, we've got distributed networks of kids not going back to university or college, we've got distributed networks of enterprise, of people not necessarily returning to the workplace. And I see that as an opportunity, not as necessarily a problem. And in the areas that I spend my time working in, I'm looking at blockchain in particular and digital identity. And I would argue that it's a paradigm shift, is that if we can move education technology from being a B2B business where technology companies supply their technology to institutions and focus on the consumer, the end user, the student, all of a sudden we've changed things considerably. And what I mean by that is that actually we can now deliver a personal learning journey to every single student everywhere. And we can subsequently deliver personal learning outcomes to each student. And the paradigm shift is if we're moving away from a traditional classroom, I'm not suggesting replace the classroom, but I'm talking about adding value to where we can identify the needs and the challenges of each student, be that around special needs, be that around autism, ADHD and the like, and actually provide resources that configure to the needs of that individual student of every age and every enterprise. All of a sudden we've got something extraordinary. And I'm also extremely optimistic and slightly naive that I don't actually think that's a major problem to achieve. We just need to focus on the objectives and try and get there. So my question is, does blockchain, digital identity, and people owning their own data, is that a significant part of the digital divide solution?
Oh, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Alan. I'm going to turn to Tom again first, because he is, after all, a professor of computing, so he might know more about blockchain than I do.
Thanks, Riva. And thanks, Alan. I mean, I think I probably would say I have healthy skepticism for things like blockchain. I think it's a very, very interesting kind of technology. I think, you know, having done some work with Companies House in the UK around kind of, you know, maintaining the integrity of the kind of a public digital and data asset. I think, you know, there's potential from distributed ledger technologies in a variety of contexts. I think sometimes it can be a solution in search of a problem. I suppose I would probably answer the question in the sense of a lot of the potential espoused by stuff like public, you know, distributed ledgers, you know, blockchain, underlying blockchain technologies. I think it just reinforces the argument for open public digital and data infrastructure. So if we're talking about things like open educational resources, and, you know, there's particularly when you start the potential impact of, say, AI in education and, you know, customized bespoke learning, I think there is obviously massive potential for that, but it has to be learner centered. It has to be, you know, it has to be auditable. It has to be, I don't think it should be in the hands of a few large private companies. So I think there's huge potential here. But actually, it has to be, you know, it has to be for the citizen, it has to be for the student, and it has to be actually very clear about governance and transparency and auditability and what happens to the data. But I think there is massive potential.
Can I just very briefly chip
Yeah.
in from a low-income country perspective? I mean, so I won't comment on the higher income country perspectives, but, you know, as we've heard in Kenya, 50% of children are just disconnected. They're not online. There is no big data about them to do artificial intelligence with, or no digital identity. I mean, Kenya is trying to bring some of those digital identity things in, but, you know, often it just leaves huge swathes of the population locked out because they don't have access to that technology. So I'm very hugely skeptical of anything that is on a per child basis in sub-Saharan Africa, just because those children, anything technological on a per child basis in sub-Saharan Africa, because children just aren't connected. They are not digital. You know, 50% of sub-Saharan Africa just isn't digital, and we have to do something for those children now rather than wait for digital to catch up and then to do something.
Can I respond to Björn, if I may?
Sure.
And I would point out, we've been arguing for the better part of 14 years, so this won't come as any surprise to him. I don't agree with you. Having spent a couple of years in China, it's all a matter of one's appetite and one's requirement for technology. In other words, there's an assumption that only wealthy people can have a smartphone, or internet connection. I categorically disagree with that. I think if there's an appetite and there's a need and there's a hunger, one of the things that you notice working in Asia is there's a real empathy with learning. There's much better appetite for students who want to improve their outcomes and to get a career and to have an engagement. So I think there's something fundamentally wrong in our society that doesn't allow that to happen. It is not a barrier of devices. It is not even a barrier of internet connectivity. It is an appetite to learn and improve the outcomes for individuals. Now, that could be a naive point of view, but as an optimist, I actually do believe that to be the case. I mean, I think it's important to be optimistic. And I think, but I would say that, you know, like China and Asia is very different. You know, when, like in sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at this, you know, the so-called development traps. I mean, that's a slightly tried term and so forth, you know, but basically, you know, the development of South Korea and things like that, of course, they're phenomenally progressed, but it's a very different set of circumstances from the situations that we have in sub-Saharan Africa. I think it's also not about denying anybody those kinds of rights and, you know, access to technology, access to devices. But like, unfortunately, we're sort of in a position where we have to prioritize which human rights to grant first, you know, and I think when you look at the economy of it, what you could actually do for a given amount of money that actually has the potential to reach all children, then, you know, the one device per child is just, it just doesn't work economically right now. It might work in 5 years or in 10 years, but, you know, there's an education need right now that, you know, needs to be met. So yes, but we have argued about, we should maybe argue about it some more over a coffee. But you made the point I'd like to confirm is that if you look at chatbot technology, which can be delivered on a very simple device, the ability to deliver digital engagement and pedagogy through a chatbot environment is a route to market, which is extremely cost effective and is beginning to evolve. But again, a much deeper debate to be had.
Yeah, and one in 10 people, I would say, 1 in 10 people in Turkana County in Kenya have a radio. 1 in 10 households have a radio. You know, never mind, you know. But yes, I mean, things will happen. I think chatbots, by the way, I think are a really interesting technology. We're working with Translators Without Borders, where they're looking at sort of, you know, chatbots and Hausa and things like that, which has been very popular. So I do think that there is a lot of mileage in those kinds of technologies, chatbots in particular.
I think I'm glad because we've also got a PhD project with Sara, haven't we, working on chatbots in education. And I think this relates to another question which I'm going to put. I don't think I can put it live, but I can. It's from Nick Sample, who's head of education at ARM, and he's asking here, with the increasing pace of change in technology, is the nature of the digital divide also constantly changing? So I think that kind of relates to that debate you're having. What do you think? Maybe Sara, do you have a view on the idea of the digital divide, or Sue? Any thoughts?
Well, Sara, I could just say something short. I think in terms of the digital skills that children need with the pace of change of technology, they're definitely changing. With the so much, you know, in AI and machine learning, we all know about that. We need young people to be more critical and evaluative about the uses of digitization and the digital world, and, you know, what's happening in the world, and be able to not just have, you know, basic skills, be able to use this and use that. They need to know why it's being used, when it's appropriate to be used, and the implications of it being used for themselves and for society. And I think that has really shifted quite significantly in the last 5 years, and we need to be looking at our digital education and our digital curricula with that in mind.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd just add, I think certainly the technology is, you know, is becoming more and more ubiquitous. The rates of ownership and the access to technology is increasing everywhere, although obviously much more slowly in some countries. But I'm not sure that that's changing the nature of the digital divide. I think wherever there's technology access, there are always inequities within, you know, across that access, whether you're looking at radio or high-powered computers. That's been the case historically, and I don't see that changing, unfortunately. I mean, somebody mentioned earlier about, you know, giving out devices is the easy bit. I was quite shocked to learn a couple of weeks ago that secondary school student in a city less than 50 miles from Cambridge, during the third wave of the pandemic, so between January and February, you know, when the schools were closed, still did not have access to a laptop at home. There was none in the home. So she had to go to school, you know, in order to access any kind of learning. It's just shocking to me that in an affluent country like England, we still haven't, you know, solved that. And yet, you know, when we look at other countries, that it's obviously a much bigger scale of challenge.
Well, thanks. So I'll move on to another question put by Melanie Grew, who is not with us live, I think, anymore, but she put an interesting question, I think probably focused a bit more on Tom's area due to the bilingualism in Wales, because she says, I'm particularly interested in the intersection of digital divide for linguistically and culturally diverse communities. So I guess there's an intersection of issues there. I don't know if you're the right person to start off with that, Tom.
Yeah, happy to. Dwi'n trio dysgu siarad Cymraeg, so like I suppose I'm trying to learn to speak Welsh. I think it's interesting in a bilingual, or the aspirations of a bilingual nation, obviously with a rich kind of cultural heritage, which has, for example, had a massive impact on the major kind of curriculum reform journey over the past 5 years. So, you know, Wales has largely followed the kind of English national curriculum since it started, and that's only since devolution to the National Assembly in 1999 and the various iterations of the curriculum. But this has been designed from the you know, it's been co-constructed with practitioners. It's bilingual from outset, and it recognises the kind of the curriculum Cymraeg, the kind of the Welsh kind of cultural and sort of heritage aspects that are important across, you know, what you consider important to be a future citizen of Wales. So, and the Welsh Government have a stated aim to, you know, the Welsh language has been on the increase for a long time, and there's a thriving Welsh language communities. There are thriving Welsh language communities online. So you can see on Twitter, on Facebook, you know, you can see S4C, which is the national broadcaster. This is a mechanism for, you know, you have bilingual schools, you have a thriving Welsh medium sector. So this is a big shift. People recognise and acknowledge the benefits of being bilingual, you know, kind of cognitively and sort of developmentally. But actually, it's the fact like there's a cultural context that's really, really important. And I think that is interesting in other bilingual or multilingual jurisdictions. So the stuff that happens in Wales is kind of interesting in other parts of the world where, you know, the other language might be English. So I think there's interesting stuff that's played out in a digital context, and that has economic imperatives, that has kind of socio-cultural imperatives too. But I think it's kind of perhaps sometimes can get swamped in the wider UK context, because you know, I suppose not many people, apart from, you know, you sometimes see stuff on the news about what happens in Wales, or, you know, very difficult to pronounce names, and it's have a bit of a giggle about stuff. But actually, you know, I think there's sometimes can be quite problematic because of the dominance of English language, and actually understanding about, yeah, a lot of people's first language of choice is Welsh, and people will tweet primarily in Welsh, and they'll interact through digital means, and their children will be educated through the medium of Welsh, certainly up to the age of 18, but maybe do their university education through the medium of Welsh. So I think this is a specific issue in Wales, but clearly is relevant for loads of other jurisdictions across the world. And I think that the digital kind of cultural aspects, where a lot of our lives and our interactions and our kind of, you know, our behaviors and our, you know, our work and our entertainment is done online, that has a massive consequence for, you know, the internet isn't just in English.
Yes, thanks. I was just reading a comment in the question and answer from Julian Desant, who's I think working in Carmarthenshire on these issues, and he says that in our experience in West Wales, our learners from disadvantaged backgrounds, especially bilingual learners, struggle to develop a voice, where voice means the capacity to participate in a discourse and have the agency in relation to its content and direction. If learning is relational and not transactional, and this is a key question online in particular, perhaps. I don't know, what do you think about that?
I'm looking forward to meeting with Julian in a week or two's time, actually. So no, I think that's a really interesting. I think I think again we could probably talk about this for another kind of an hour or so. But I think there's a lot of awareness about this in Wales, because actually there's like I said, the socio-cultural aspect, but there's the economic aspects. But it's the different demographic perspective. So there are young people whose identity, say their digital identity, manifests their kind of Welsh culture and identity that's the way they do stuff online. So, you can be quite naive to this kind of stuff. And, for example, the Welsh Government have an aspiration by 2050 to have 1 million Welsh speakers. So there's, legislative statutory footing for the language, and there are clear aspirations to be a bilingual nation. So this is only going to become more of an issue kind of going forward. So, no, not an issue, but to be a really interesting theme going forwards in Wales.
Thanks very much. That's obviously another one of those really big questions that we'll continue to struggle with, and I hope you develop some really good solutions for the rest of us to learn from with your work with the Welsh Government. I'm just going to put one from Yishan Du, who's a master's student from Hong Kong University. This is a question particularly for Sara. Digital education is also playing an increasingly important role in higher education and is even more necessary under the influence of the epidemic. What do you think about the digital divide in higher education and how that evolved during the pandemic period? Is that a worthwhile topic? The digital divide in higher education evolving during the pandemic period.
I'll speak very briefly because I've spoken far too much, but yes, I think it's been very similar in the sense of what we've seen in schools and in other settings. We've done some work recently. We did some surveys in the aftermath of the immediate aftermath of the first lockdown, and I think we saw exactly the same challenges. The kind of students not being able to meaningfully engage in emergency remote teaching because of their kind of setting, their environment, their device access, whatever. It was exactly the same sort of challenges, but we think they're fine because they're at university. So, it doesn't surprise me. I'll share a couple of links into the chat. I'm happy to, I'll let colleagues come in as well.
Actually, can I just add another question from Yishan Du, which she's also asked, was particularly for Sara, was about the role of gender in all that. The gender, I noticed that to maximize learning outcomes for girls is one of the areas of the Hub program. And she's wondering what specific work is being done about the gender issue. So that's one specifically for Sara.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're just starting off on that, but it is a really important focus, particularly for our sponsor, the FCDO, and it's a theme that cuts across our other areas of research as well. So, for example, when we're looking at TPD, which is my specific remit in the Hub, one thing we would want to focus on is how teachers can be equipped to help to develop gender responsive pedagogies. In terms of what's being done, I'd point to the Girls Education Challenge, which is particularly focusing on that issue and has just produced a report, which I can share the link to, which is quite interesting and talks quite a lot about how to develop gender responsive pedagogies and how, what issues there are with learners and what issues there are with teachers. When we've looked at this, we've been reviewing the evidence on this in the Hub, finding some of the evidence about access to technology outside school as well as in school being differential for girls, because of attitudes about domestic roles and other gender stereotypes and so on. Teachers also have those kinds of stereotypes and attitudes. So there's quite a lot of challenge in that, but using different technologies can address that if the right kind of pedagogy is going along with it, I suppose. Girls tend to sort of favor particular forms of technology use and to have lower confidence in using technology. I can see Sue wants to come in as well, and she probably works with girls on a daily basis who have these kinds of attitudes. So it'd be good to hear what she says. But just to wrap up and say, a lot of the research doesn't look at how technology can overcome gender bias within sort of existing education systems. And that's an area where we want to focus our work. Sue, do you want to add?
Please. Yeah.
Yes, sure. I was very interested in what you're saying, Sarah, and I think we should carry on talking about gender responsive pedagogies because yeah, it's really important. We're in, I mean, obviously, you know, England based, so not as broad as you're talking. We're involved in a sort of large scale set of interventions to try and see which of the barriers can be, you know, can be effectively overcome by changing the pedagogy and that sort of thing. And you know, we know that girls don't feel they belong in technology. They don't feel it's like relevant to them. They lack encouragement, and these are really big things, even where there is a lot of access to technology going on, you know. So we're trying out various different approaches with randomized control trials to try and see which intervention is most effective, but just based in England. But it'd be interesting to find out a bit more about, you know, the EdTech Hub gender work as well.
Well, thanks. I've just got, I'm conscious of time, but I think we've got time for one more question that's been here for a while from Dina Facado, who is from Mexico, which is a PhD student here at Cambridge. And she's saying that Professor Tom Crick mentioned digital competencies, but this is a question I think is addressed particularly to Sue, is digital citizenship, digital rights, but what about awareness of these competencies? Often parents and teachers don't acknowledge the importance of them or how to solve them. Is there anything that we can do from this end? What do you think about that, Sue, the digital competencies angle?
I think we've got a long way to go with digital education and computing education in school, particularly in primary schools. I think there's a wariness amongst lots of primary teachers who have to teach lots of different things at once, to have to also sort of do a lot of sort of teaching around computing and digital skills and that sort of thing. And of course, if the and this comes back to the gender thing as well, you know, if parents and carers at home don't feel competent, or if they see role models that don't show them that they should be engaging in that, then that's, you know, it kind of causes barriers. So I mean, in England, interestingly, in 2012, the teacher training for all teachers took out the clause that said all new teachers need to understand about how to use ICT in the classroom and how to use digital skills, because it was thought that everybody knew, you know, all adults, you know, we know what to do. We know how to incorporate digital skills into teaching of other subjects, you know, in general. And but we know that from the that 22% of adults don't have the basic digital skills, which was I had on one of my slides. So I think the teacher training should incorporate much more about technology use in different subject areas, and the more that we can do to make sort of parent-school partnerships work to sort of support parents in this, the better. And I could go on for this for another Tom's magic 3 minutes. I could go on for too long, so I'll let somebody else say something.
Right. We don't have too much longer, but I think, well, that's a brilliant answer. Thank you. And I just want to bring in a question that we've had from Miroslav Navrat, who's in the Czech Ministry of Education and is head of the Digital Education Unit. And he's asking specifically for Sara, what is the best way to identify those with the highest need for help?
I think strengthening data management, actually, which is again one of our focus areas in the hub. You know, we have quite a lot of data. I mean, you know, we've shown you some graphs today I've told you some statistics. So we do know quite a lot about the digital divide and who has access and what sort of issues they face. But I think gathering further sort of data of that kind at a system level could be a powerful tool, but it also has to be combined with a sort of needs assessment. You know, data is all very well by itself, but we need to know, you know, what people need. We need to know, you know, the levels of learners, and here, you know, schools know their students best. we need to look at teachers through surveys and so on. We need to look at schools and districts in deprived areas. So yeah, I think those are the two main strategies we would use. And
Thanks,
yeah, and target the help accordingly.
Well, thanks very much. We've got quite a few questions that have come in, but I'm wondering if it might be time for me to wrap up and try and sum up from a DEFI point of view looking forward, because we don't want to run over. A lot of people are going to have to leave at 6:30, and any question is likely to be too interesting and take us too much. I was really pleased to see that we had the contributors here from such a range of fields, from industry and also from ministries of education, not just in Wales, but also in Czechoslovakia. And that kind of reminds me of the purpose of DEFI. What we're trying to do is host conversations, not just for the sake of talk, which can be a bit of a danger with academics. You can get an awful lot of talk. It would be nice to know how we can construct these so that they lead to change and to action. It's quite challenging. It's kind of, I see it like Jeff Mulgan talks about the challenge of collective intelligence. How can we use this amazing technology of the internet to actually support a collective intelligence process where we get the best voices in on these issues, we get the evidence, we get the reasoning, in order to design ways forward that emerge from this process. So we're planning a number of further talks with our partners in ARM and with Cambridge Partnerships for Education. So do bear with us, but also offer any advice you can on that, on how we can turn this talk into action. But I think personally I've learned a lot today, and I hope that you have. And so thanks very much, especially to all our speakers, to Tom and Sarah, Björn and Sue, but also to those in the background who made it happen. Jack Clarkson, thank you very much, and Jude Hannan, who's been so busy organizing everything, and Louis Major, who's been a great help. But also, of course, all our amazing audience and speakers and all the people who put questions. So thank you all very much. I know I'm leaving, I think, 2 or 3 minutes early, but I think that might make a nice change for these events, because some of you are going to have to get off. So do stick with us, or do sign up on our website so that you'll get news about further events. Sign up to DEFI and newsletters. And as I say, do offer advice on how we can support this community in Cambridge, but also globally, so that we can get some good advice to industry, policymakers and practitioners on how to deal with issues like the digital divide. And I hope you found it useful. Anyone want to join me in saying some final words?
Thank you very much. Thank you, DEFI, for putting it on. It's been very enjoyable to take part. Thank you, everybody, for your questions.
Yeah, superb. Thank you.
Oh yeah, thanks so much, Tom. Such an interesting perspective. It's so great to have neighboring countries doing innovative things that we can learn from, isn't it? From everybody's sake. Okay, well, thank you all very much then, and bye, and see you again the next time.
Thank you.